6 people walked into a theme park expecting the same thing you do every time you go. A good day, maybe a little fear, the controlled kind, the kind that ends with your heart pounding and your hands in the air and everyone around you laughing because you made it. They bought their tickets, they waited in line, they sat down, pulled something over their lap, and trusted that whoever built this thing had thought of everything. And most of the time, that trust holds. Most of the time. But tonight, we're not talking about most of the time. We're following 6 people through their final minutes. Not from a distance, not as a headline, but from the moment they woke up that morning to the exact chain of decisions, failures, and overlooked details that changed everything. Because not one of these moments started as a tragedy. They started exactly like your last trip to a theme park. Normal, loud, full of people who had no idea what was coming. The warning signs were already there. Some were buried in the engineering. Some were sitting in a report no one acted on. Some were spoken out loud by the person who felt it coming, and still weren't enough to stop what happened next. This is what it looks like when everything that's supposed to protect you doesn't. There's a word in German, verrückt. It means insane. And when you stood at the base of Schlitterbahn Waterpark's newest attraction in Kansas City, Missouri, that word made perfect sense. The structure rose so high above the tree line that it broke the skyline. A conveyor belt was needed just to carry riders to the top because the climb was too steep, too long, too punishing to walk. At certain points during the ride, the raft was designed to briefly leave the surface of the slide entirely. A fraction of a second of complete weightlessness at speed. That wasn't a malfunction. That was the point. Caleb Schwab was 10 years old on the morning of August 7th, 2016. Old enough to love the rush, young enough to assume that if a ride was open, it was safe. His father worked for the state of Kansas. They'd been given complimentary passes for a family day. Just another summer Sunday. Ice cream. Sunscreen, lines snaking through the park under the kind of heat that makes you grateful for water slides. He had no reason to think this one was any different. What he couldn't have known, what most people at that park didn't know, was that Verrückt had a history. Before it ever opened to the public, test dummies had reportedly been launched off the track during early trials. Design modifications had been rushed through, not because the engineers were satisfied, but because the ride needed to open. It had been marketed, it had been hyped. There was a deadline, and deadlines, as it turns out, don't care much about physics. Caleb climbed the tower that morning, 264 steps. At the top, riders were weighed. The raft's weight distribution was critical. He was grouped with 2 adult women. The 3 of them settled in. The restraint came over their laps. Ahead of them was a drop so steep you couldn't see the bottom from the top. Just a narrow slide vanishing over the edge, and beyond it, nothing but open sky. The raft tipped forward. Gravity took them instantly. The first drop was violent, in the way only real speed is violent, not the theatrical kind, but the kind that compresses your chest and tells your body something serious is happening. Then came the climb. Because Verrückt wasn't just a single drop. It was engineered like a water roller coaster. Down, then surging back up a second hill before the final descent. It was at the crest of that second hill that something changed. The raft went airborne, not the controlled, designed-for kind of airborne, the wrong kind. the kind that happens when forces exceed what the structure was built to handle. Overhead, metal support bars ran across the slide, fitted with netting that was meant to catch anything that went wrong. The netting wasn't enough. The raft struck the overhead structure. The two adult women survived, injured and bleeding and in shock. When the raft came back down to the slide, Caleb was gone. He died on the ride. Below, people were still waiting in line. The investigation that followed uncovered what investigators almost always find in cases like this: not one single catastrophic mistake, but a sequence of smaller ones, a design that had been pushed past the limits of what was safe. Safety calculations that didn't account for real-world variables. Warnings that existed somewhere in a report or a conversation or a brief hesitation, and then were moved past because the ride needed to open. Verrückt was built to break records. In the end, it broke something it was never supposed to touch. There are things about that story that are hard to sit with. The fact that it was a water slide. The fact that it was a Sunday. The fact that a child stood in line, climbed 264 steps, and sat down in complete trust. But what makes it harder is knowing that the danger had been there long before he arrived. Sometimes the failure is buried in the design itself, invisible to everyone except the people who built it, and even then, only if they're willing to look. Other times, the danger comes from something different, something more human. A system that was working exactly the way it was supposed to, right up until the moment someone decided to turn it off. If you love stories like this, do like and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in the comment section. Modern roller coasters are built around one fundamental guarantee. Two trains cannot occupy the same track at the same time. Not accidentally, not under any normal operating condition. The systems that prevent it aren't optional. They're the backbone of how the ride functions. Sensors, block zones, automated stops, layered fail-safes, each one designed to catch what the one before it might miss. At Alton Towers in Staffordshire, England, that system was in place on the Smiler, a coaster that held the world record for inversions. 14 of them. Tight, relentless, disorienting. Even its branding leaned into the feeling of being overwhelmed. The smiling face stretched just a little too wide. The colors just slightly too bright. You weren't supposed to feel in control. That was the whole idea. On June 2nd, 2015, the ride hit a problem. Mid-afternoon, an empty test carriage was sent around the track as part of routine operations. It didn't complete the circuit. Instead, it stalled, stranded on a section of elevated track above the ground. The system detected it immediately and did exactly what it was built to do. It shut everything down and waited. That's where the story should have stayed quiet for a while. Engineers check the track. The obstruction is confirmed and cleared. The ride restarts. Everyone goes home. But that's not what happened. Staff believed the stationary carriage had moved. They believed the system was reading the situation incorrectly. And so, with confidence that the track was clear, they overrode the safety system and dispatched a new train. That train was full of riders. Leah Washington was 19 years old. She was there with her boyfriend, sitting in the front carriage, the same way thousands of people had sat in that same seat before her. She didn't know about the stalled carriage. She had no way to know. She just felt the familiar pull of the chain lift, the slow mechanical climb, and then the tip forward into the first drop. Somewhere ahead of her, still on the track, was a carriage that was never supposed to be there. Roller coasters don't give you time to process. The speed is the whole point. By the time anyone could have understood what they were seeing, it was already over. The moving train struck the stationary one at high speed, metal into metal. The front carriages absorbed the full force. Everything stopped instantly. The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was the silence of people still conscious, still present, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense yet. They were trapped on an elevated, twisted section of track. Emergency services spent hours getting to them. Leah Washington lost her leg. Others suffered injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Not the kind you see and then recover from. The kind that changed the shape of every day afterward. The system had worked perfectly. It detected the problem. It stopped the ride. It held everything in place the way it was designed to. And then a human decision removed the only thing standing between those two trains. That's the part that stays with you. Not a mechanical failure, not a design flaw, just someone who believed with complete confidence that they knew better than the system. And they were wrong. But even that, even an overridden safety system, at least leaves something to point to. A decision. A moment. A person who made the call and has to live with what came after. What haunts a different kind of story is when there is no system failure, no override, no one making the wrong call. Just a person sitting in a seat, feeling something, saying something, and the moment moving forward anyway. She felt it before anything went wrong. That's the part of this story that never leaves you, not because it's dramatic, but because it's so human. A quiet moment of unease, an instinct that something was slightly, subtly off. Six Flags Over Texas had rebuilt the Texas Giant in the years before 2013, transforming what had been a traditional wooden coaster into a hybrid, steel track on a wooden structure. The changes made it faster, smoother, and significantly more intense. On the day Rosa Esparza came to the park with her son, the ride was operating normally. Trains loading, riders cycling through, the ordinary rhythm of a busy summer day at a theme park. Rosa settled into her seat and pulled the lap restraint down over her waist. Something didn't feel right. She said so. Accounts from witnesses describe her expressing concern to the ride operators. Not in panic, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it was heard. The restraint didn't feel the way it was supposed to feel. Not obviously broken, not swinging loose, just not quite right. Operators checked it. From the outside, the bar appeared locked. The system registered no fault. The train was cleared for dispatch. In a busy park, these checks are fast. They have to be. The line is moving. The day is moving. Everything is calibrated for throughput, and a restraint that looks locked and reads as locked is a restraint that gets waved through. The train climbed. That familiar sound, click, 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 marking each foot of height. At the top, the world opened up the way it always does. The park below, the people, the full, stomach-dropping perspective of exactly how high you are. Then the train tipped forward. What a lap bar is designed to do seems simple until you understand the forces it has to work against. At speed, on a steep descent, the physics are working in every direction simultaneously. Forward momentum, vertical drop, lateral shifts through turns. The restraint has to hold against all of it. And it does, reliably, for almost every rider. Unless the fit isn't quite right. Unless the forces push in a direction the design didn't fully anticipate. Unless the margin, the small invisible buffer between safe and not safe, runs out at exactly the wrong moment. As the coaster plunged down the first drop, Rosa's restraint failed her. She was ejected from the ride. Her son was still on the train. By the time it reached the bottom, Rosa Esparza was gone. She died at the scene. The investigation afterward found what was already becoming a familiar story. Design assumptions about rider dimensions and restraint performance that didn't account for the full range of real people who would sit in those seats. A system that functioned as designed. A person who sat outside the margins that design had imagined. She knew something was wrong. The machine didn't. And in the gap between those two things, a life ended. There's something in that gap between what a person feels and what a system measures that this next story answers differently. Because in Texas, the warning came from inside, from someone sitting in the seat. But what happens when there is no warning at all? When the system reads green, the operators see nothing, the riders feel nothing out of the ordinary, and then a single component carrying everything simply gives way. If you love stories like this, do like and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in the comment section. It was the kind of ride that didn't feel dangerous. That's important to understand. The Cyclone at Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom was a swing ride, a large pendulum arm with a gondola at the end, designed to arc riders high into the air and bring them back with controlled force. Back and forth, higher with each pass. The sensation was disorienting in the best way. Not terrifying, the kind of thrill that makes people immediately want to ride again. Sergio Cruz was there with his girlfriend. No reason to pause, no uneasy feeling, just two people settling in for a ride that had run thousands of times without incident, while the park hummed along around them in the particular way parks do on busy afternoons. Music, laughter, the smell of funnel cake, lines shuffling forward in the heat. They were strapped in, lifted, set in motion. Behind the movement was a system of cables under enormous tension. Every arc of the pendulum loaded and unloaded those cables in a cycle the engineers had mapped carefully. The forces were immense, but they were known, and known forces, in theory, can be built for. In theory, at the peak of one of those arcs, briefly suspended, weightless for just a moment, a cable snapped, not degraded gradually into failure, not warning anyone with sound or vibration or visible wear, just holding, and then not. The gondola dropped. Without that structural support, there was no controlled arc, no designed motion, no return path to where it was supposed to be. There was only free fall and the catastrophic stop at the end of it. The gondola slammed down. The passengers had no time to brace, no time to understand, no time at all. Sergio Cruz died from the impact. His girlfriend survived, but she lost both legs. In the aftermath, the investigation would trace the failure back to its origin, the way these investigations always do. A cable under stress, maintenance cycles. Inspection records the slow, invisible accumulation of wear in a component that no one had flagged as critical because it had never failed before. That's the particular cruelty of mechanical failure at its worst. It gives you nothing to act on. No warning, no hesitation, no gap between what the person feels and what the system reads, because both are saying the same thing right up until the moment they can't. One piece held everything together, and when it didn't, everything went with it. There's a grief that comes with mechanical failure that's clean and devastating at the same time. It's a failure of engineering, of inspection, of the assumptions we make about what will hold. But the next story is different, because the system didn't fail. The engineering didn't fail. The inspections, the maintenance, the restraints, all of it was exactly as it should have been. The only thing that wasn't accounted for was a 15-year-old boy making one small decision in the middle of a ride. And what followed wasn't just a tragedy. It was the moment the entire industry changed. Theme parks in the early 1960s were built on a feeling. The feeling that inside these gates, everything had been imagined for you, controlled, designed. Safe in a way the outside world couldn't always promise. Walt Disney had built the Matterhorn bobsleds at Disneyland in 1959, a steel track threading through an artificial mountain, with sharp corners and sudden drops designed to feel fast and unpredictable without ever actually being dangerous. The safety system was almost elegant in its simplicity. The ride was designed so that staying seated kept you safe. The physics of the track, the walls of the bobsled, the natural posture of a rider in motion, it all worked together. You didn't need a complicated restraint if the ride itself kept you where you needed to be. What it couldn't account for was someone deciding not to stay there. Mark Maples was 15 years old in the spring of 1964. A teenager at the most famous theme park in the world, in an era when the concept of catastrophic theme park failure barely existed in the public imagination. These places were safe. They were made to be safe. The entire brand promise was that you could trust them completely. At some point during the ride, the exact reason is lost to time, Mark stood up. Maybe he wanted a better view. Maybe he was adjusting his position. Maybe it was the kind of impulsive moment that teenagers have, the kind that almost always ends with nothing more than a story to tell. A brief movement, a second of poor judgment, the sort of thing that happens 100 times a day without consequence. This time, the consequence was immediate. The bobsled was moving at speed through a high section of the track when Mark lost his balance. He fell from the car onto the track below. And the ride, because there was no system that could detect a rider on the track, because that possibility was outside what the design had imagined, didn't stop. Behind his sled, another car was already coming. Mark Maples died 3 days later from his injuries. The park was quiet about it at first, the way parks often are when something unthinkable occurs inside a world built on joy and escapism. But the silence didn't hold. The story spread. Questions were asked, and the industry, slowly, uncomfortably, had to sit with a question it hadn't fully faced before. What happens when the person inside the ride is the variable you didn't plan for? The answer that followed shaped every theme park built since. Restraints became mandatory where they hadn't been. Ride design started accounting for human behavior rather than assuming it. The safety frameworks that now feel obvious that we take for granted every time we sit down and pull something across our lap were forged in part by what happened to a 15-year-old boy on a spring afternoon in Anaheim. He was the reason the rules changed. The ride worked exactly as it was designed. It just wasn't designed for him. 6 stories. And by now you might feel like you've seen the shape of how these things happen. A design failure, a human override, a warning ignored, a mechanical breakdown, a moment of poor judgment. But the last one doesn't fit neatly into any of those. Because in the final story, nothing was obviously wrong. The restraint came down, the operators checked their rows, the system gave no fault, there was no feeling, no hesitation, no stalled carriage on the track. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look, right up until the drop. Some rides announce themselves. You can see them from the parking lot. Hear the screams from 2 attractions over. They're designed to make a statement before you even get in line. Perilous Plunge at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California, was one of those rides. Merely 12 stories of vertical ascent, followed by one of the steepest drops of any water ride in the world. It lifted you slowly, mechanically, deliberately, and then it let you go. The whole ride was essentially that one moment. The pause at the top. The view. The realization of what was below you. And then the plunge. Christopher Bowman took his seat on the day he came to the park. The lap bar came down across his waist, locked. Operators made their checks, scanned the rows, saw what they needed to see. The boat began its climb. From the outside, it's a spectacular thing to watch. The boat rises impossibly high, it seems, and then tips over the edge and drops in a cascade of noise and white water. From the inside, the ascent is slow and anticipatory in a way that builds something in your chest. Not quite fear, but close enough to it that the distinction stops mattering. At the top, the boat paused, then dropped. What happens to the body during a near vertical drop at that speed is immediate and total. Forces that are calculated, engineered, tested, acting all at once. For most riders, the lap bar holds against all of it. For most riders, the assumptions baked into the design align with the person sitting in the seat. For Christopher, they didn't. As the boat accelerated down the drop, the forces shifted in a direction the restraint wasn't sufficient to counter. Not upward, not outward. Downward, which is the direction that matters least when the ride is still at the top, and the direction that matters most when it isn't. He slipped beneath the lap bar and was gone before the boat reached the bottom. The ride completed its cycle. The system detected nothing, because there was nothing in the system designed to detect what had just happened. Christopher Bowman died. The ride stopped. The investigations began. And somewhere in a boardroom or an engineering review, the question that always follows these moments was asked again, how did we not see this? The answer, as it almost always is, was that someone had made assumptions about body size, about force distribution, about what the restraint would need to do and what it would never have to do. The ride had operated safely for years. The lap bar had held and held until the day the person sitting in the seat fell outside the edges of what the design had imagined. It looked secure until the moment it needed to be.